Number 8. Austin Lee Edwards. Austin Lee Edwards was a Virginia state trooper for less than a year before he resigned in October 2022. He decided to pursue a new career with the Washington County Sheriff's Office in California. The reasons behind his decision were never revealed, but the timing seems to line up with the point where his life spiraled out of control. Less than a month after arriving in California, Edwards landed at the center of a murder investigation. It all started when someone called 911 to report a nervous-looking young woman who was seen getting in Edwards' car. Officers arrived to the neighborhood to find a house engulfed in flames. Inside were the remains of a couple in their 60s, Mark and Sherry Wyneck, and their 38-year-old daughter, Brooke. Investigators soon discovered that the terrified young woman described in the 911 call was Brooke's daughter, and she was still with her captor. When law enforcement caught up with Edwards' vehicle, he shot at them. The police returned fire, and Edwards was fatally shot. It was later discovered that Edwards had catfished his victim online, pretending to be much younger than he actually was, and drove to her house after finding her address. As it turned out, he had a troubling history that included a violent altercation with his father and being involuntarily held at a psych ward. This didn't stop him from becoming a cop. It's one of those cases where it's hard not to wonder, in hindsight, if any major red flags were missed, or if he was just really good at concealing his inner turmoil. Number 7. Christina Guess. Christina Guess worked as a corrections officer in the Florida state prison system for 12 years before she got busted for trafficking drugs and suddenly found herself on the opposite side of the prison bars. The bust ended her law enforcement career, but once she served her time, she had the opportunity to turn her life around. She unfortunately chose to do otherwise. In 2022, she was busted again for allegedly being the leader of a massive drug trafficking ring. The sting came as part of a months-long investigation by state and federal authorities who are accusing Guess of smuggling 24 pounds, 10.9 kilos, of methamphetamine into the U.S. from Mexico over a one-year period. Volusia County Chief Sheriff's Deputy Brian Henderson told Fox 13 that the meth was diluted to street-level potency and most likely yielded more like 80 to 100 pounds, 36 to 45 kilograms of the drug. Guess was hit with a laundry list of felonies, including multiple counts of trafficking, conspiracy to traffic, selling drugs in close proximity to a daycare, and more. 10 alleged accomplices were also charged in connection with the case. Number 6. Gary Stroud. It wasn't unusual for Diane Stroud to travel extensively on her own, so when she disappeared in 2011, her loved ones initially assumed that maybe she went on a trip. A month after Diane went missing, her husband, retired Mentor, Ohio police officer Gary Stroud, told the couple's adult children that their mother had abandoned the family to join a cult. This was highly out of character for Diane, and people didn't believe it. 2 weeks after that, Gary and Diane's daughter, Stephanie, noticed a putrid odor in the family's garage. She called the police and asked them to check it out. Responding officers found Diane's decomposed remains in a sleeping bag. When they tried to confront Gary, he was uncooperative, so they tased him and took him into custody on suspicion of murder. A medical examiner ruled that Diane died from blunt force trauma. She had over a dozen head wounds from being bashed to death with a hammer. In the meantime, investigators discovered that her and Gary's relationship was strained leading up to her death. They were in financial trouble and were at risk of losing their home, and while Gary never revealed his reason for killing Diane, the couple's circumstances leading up to the murder offer some possible insight. To spare his children from the trauma of sitting through a trial, Stroud took a deal and pleaded guilty to murder and gross abuse of a corpse. He was sentenced to 16 years to life in prison. Number 5. Jason McIntosh. Hoover, Alabama police officer Jason McIntosh and his wife Megan Montgomery separated in 2019 after just a year of marriage. The split came after McIntosh shot Megan in the arm during a domestic dispute. She got a restraining order, and McIntosh's gun was taken away. He also resigned from his position on the police force. 9 months later, Jason got his gun back, despite obvious reasons to consider him a potential danger, especially to his estranged wife. Just weeks later, Megan was found clinging to life with gunshot wounds in the parking lot of an athletic complex. She succumbed to her injuries just 20 minutes later. It took 2 days to identify the young woman, who had no ID on her at the time. Megan's friends told police that she was out having drinks with them on the night of her disappearance. At some point during the evening, McIntosh showed up at the restaurant they were at and instructed Megan to go with him. She was never seen alive again. In hindsight, Megan's pals regretted not asking more questions when they noticed that she seemed afraid of McIntosh. But they stayed out of it, and at least one person assumed that her husband had caught her doing something bad. They never would have imagined that things were about to turn deadly, or they would have intervened to protect their friend. As part of an agreement with prosecutors, McIntosh pleaded guilty to murder in exchange for getting a capital murder charge dropped and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Number 4. Ronnie Lessa and Elsio Vieira de Queiroz. Rio de Janeiro councilwoman Marielle Franco was determined to change the way police treat marginalized communities in her city. She was also the only black woman on the city's 51-member council, and she fiercely advocated for the communities she believed needed a voice the most. Her life was cruelly cut short in 2018 when someone shot her 9 times during her drive home one evening. Franco's driver was also killed. A painstaking investigation ensued as authorities uncovered evidence that Franco's murder was meticulously planned out months ahead of time. Their findings landed former military police officer Ronnie Lessa and former police officer Elsio Vieira de Queiroz at the top of the suspect list. They were charged in connection with the murders in 2019. At the time, the investigation was ongoing and detectives were still trying to figure out whether the suspects were hired to carry out the killings or if they were the actual masterminds. Lessa is accused of being the shooter, while Vieira de Queiroz allegedly drove the car that the fatal bullets were fired from. The pair are thought to be members of a paramilitary criminal underworld made up of current and former members of law enforcement. These so-called militias began appearing in Rio de Janeiro in large numbers during the early 2000s. Instead of enforcing the law, they ruthlessly control entire neighborhoods and extort civilians. They're not afraid to kill if they don't get their way, and black Brazilians are more likely to be victimized by both these groups and the actual police. Achieving justice for Franco's murder would set the example that violent paramilitary street gangs will not be tolerated and that the city is heading toward the changes that the brave councilwoman envisioned. Number 3. Joseph Milonech. During his 2-decade career as a sheriff's deputy in Wyoming County, New York, Joseph Milonech lured an unknown number of troubled and vulnerable young men to his house for intimate encounters. He targeted victims he met through criminal investigations at his job and offered them work on his farm. It wasn't the type of work they were envisioning, and Milonech preyed on their need for basic things like food and shelter to pressure them into the arrangement. By the time 2018 rolled around, he was retired from police work and was a member of the Perry Town Board. Suspicions about his personal life had long been the topic of whispered gossip in the community, and an investigation into these suspicions was underway after someone reported the abuse to state police. Due to the state statute of limitations on the crimes he was accused of, prosecutors couldn't pursue criminal charges against Milonech, even if they wanted to. Even the officials carrying out the investigation clarified that they were doing it for the sake of transparency and because the community deserved answers. But Milonech continued to fear that they would find a way to throw him in jail. The 60-year-old fatally gunned down 32-year-old Robert Irvin III, the victim who he thought was at risk of exposing his double life. He then dialed 911 and confessed to what he had just done. Milonech's decision to needlessly kill someone he had already caused plenty of damage to did the exact opposite of helping him avoid prison, and it did nothing to stop his past misconduct from being revealed. Other survivors had already come forward and talked to the investigators, and there was no hiding the truth at that point. Irvin's murder was truly senseless. Milonech pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. He'll be 75 years old when he reaches his earliest possible release date in 2033. Number 2. Duke Pearson. During the summer of 1967, 2 women vanished in Spokane, Washington. 47-year-old Ruby Lampson was the first to be reported missing in June of that year. 2 months later, 31-year-old Dorothy Fielding failed to return home from her job at a supermarket. She was married at the time, but she was having an affair with a former sheriff's deputy named Duke Pearson. Pearson was fired from his job the previous year for behaving in a strange and threatening manner toward his colleagues. About a month after Dorothy Fielding vanished, Pearson's pregnant wife, Sandra, was found dead from what appeared to be the tragic decision to take her own life. Pearson was always on law enforcement's radar as a person of interest in Dorothy's disappearance, including when her brutally murdered remains were found 8 months after she went missing. Investigators questioned Pearson but ultimately released him without charges. Pearson also became a suspect in Ruby Lampson's murder after her remains were found in 1971, and detectives began to question whether he was responsible for his wife's death. All 3 cases were considered cold until they were reopened in 2018 at the urging of a tipster. Unlike many revived cases, detectives built a case against Pearson for Dorothy Fielding's murder based largely on circumstantial evidence rather than DNA or forensics. But they believed they had a shot at convicting Pearson and obtained a warrant for first-degree murder in early 2019. He died just days before they planned to serve it at the age of 85. Since then, law enforcement announced plans to put the rest of the pieces together, including Ruby Lampson's murder and Sandra Pearson's suspicious death. Pearson maintained his innocence his entire life, but even some of his children suspected him of killing at least one person. Determined to finally bring some resolution to the unsolved cases, authorities continue to encourage anyone with information to come forward. Number 1. Robert Visoza. Maryland resident Robert Visoza's life began to spiral out of control years before it became obvious that he was mentally unstable. Between 2007 and 2019, during his career as a Baltimore police officer, he was disciplined numerous times. He managed to remain on the force even after a trial board found him guilty of mistreating and harassing several female co-workers. Instead of firing Visoza, the board voted to demote him, but he only lasted a few more months before he was canned for falling asleep on the job. Visoza's mental state continued to deteriorate following his termination. He finally snapped in late 2021 when he kidnapped his daughters from their home in Pennsylvania with the help of Baltimore County Sergeant Tia Bynum. The partners in crime tortured the girl's mother, Marissa Visoza, for nearly 24 hours. Marissa later told the police that Bynum and Visoza bound her and forced her to take drugs before she managed to escape. A few days later, Visoza, Bynum, and his daughters were found dead. Robert had killed everyone before turning the weapon on himself. Marissa Visoza criticized the handling of the investigation, which moved along at a disturbingly slow pace despite the urgency she approached law enforcement with after being held captive by her ex. Right before the kidnapping, Marissa had obtained a protective order against Robert for her and the kids, yet police took 18 hours to serve it, which, in this case, proved to be too long. It took a full day after she filed the complaint for police to carry out a search warrant on Visoza's home. By then, it was empty. Investigators allegedly remained a step behind the suspect for the remainder of the manhunt, which sadly ended in death. The Pennsylvania State Attorney General declined to pursue charges against law enforcement, but was still reportedly concerned about the obvious lapses in the police response and certain decisions that were made during the kidnapping investigation. Thanks for watching. Would you rather live next door to a former cop who thinks he can intimidate you and boss you around because of his past career, or confront a short-tempered friend who works in law enforcement about how you think they're abusing their power? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.